Fort Street High School acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. My name is Audrey Trung, and I'm the SRC President at Fort Street High School. I'm joined by my friend Peter Tran, who is the Vice President of the SRC.
Welcome to everyone watching the first webinar of the Fort Street Future Leaders Week, hosted by Fort Street High School Student Representative Council. Fort Street High School is a co-educational, academically selective public high school with a long and proud history. Established in 1849 as a model school, it is the oldest government high school in Australia. The school fosters an environment where intelligent young men and women can express their individuality and develop a strong sense of belonging and commitment to social justice. We have a strong focus on student leadership and promoting positive values and developing a sense of global citizenship. The school community truly represents multicultural Australia and is a harmonious community which respects each individual. Students come from the first 100 suburbs of Sydney. Our students speak about 40 different languages and enrich the life of this great school, a school which is known for its tolerance and acceptance.
Our first guest, Fortian himself, who graduated from the school in 1955, an international jurist, educator, and most notably, the longest-serving Justice of the High Court of Australia from 1996 to 2009, the Honourable Michael Kirby AC CMG. He has worked on international teams for the United Nations, the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Global Fund Against AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. He was also elected President of the International Commission of Jurists and served from 1995 to 1998, a role in which he advocated for giving consideration to sexuality as a vital element of human rights.
In 1991, Mr. Kirby was awarded the Australian Human Rights Medal. In 1998, he was named the laureate of the UNESCO Prize for Human Rights Education. In 2010, he was named the co-winner of the Gruber Justice Prize. In 2011, he received the inaugural Australian Privacy Medal. Mr. Kirby has also had numerous honorary degrees bestowed upon him by both Australian and international universities. Honourable Michael Kirby, it's a privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you for having me. It's always a good thing to be engaged again with my old school, Fort Street High School in Sydney.
Would you be able to give a quick introduction, a quick biography about your career so far?
I'm glad you mentioned so far because it's still going on. I am presently the co-chair of the Human Rights Institute of the International Bar Association in London. And because of that, this morning I was in touch with the London head office of the International Bar Association to consider what we could do to speak up for the people in Kabul, in Afghanistan, and in particular for the women who are judges in Afghanistan, who were helped to found their independent judiciary and bar association, and who are now facing the possibility within the next few days of terrible things happening to them. They put their faith in us in the Western communities to support them, and now we are scrambling out, as we earlier did in Vietnam, and as we have done elsewhere. So this is a time of great suffering and great injustice in the world, and it is very important for Australians, and in particular for Australian school students who will inherit the world, to be aware of the world around us and of our obligation for people who are less fortunate than we are, and our obligation in particular to stand up for universal human rights, the rule of law, and justice in every land of the world.
It's quite terrible to watch from here as an Australian student, so it's quite amazing to see you in front of my screen and to hear that you've done such amazing work for that, and you are doing work for that.
Yes, it's still going on. And you
Yes.
probably saw, as I did, those desperate people who clung on to an American airliner,
Oh, yes.
taking people out. They were so frightened that they clutched onto it and they fell from the sky to their deaths. This is the fear that exists in parts of the world. And we who live in relative peace and comfort, and to some extent in a land of justice, we should be very conscious of our obligation, of our blessings, of our need to be aware of people much less fortunate than we are, and to stand up, speak up, and throughout our lives work for the betterment of human beings everywhere, and for animals, and for all our planet, our beautiful blue planet. That is the inheritance that those who are watching this program will receive from us, and they must make the most of it.
You have done so much for the community on a more local scale, so in Sydney, and also, like, obviously from what you've just told us, on an international scale. You're a great example of leadership for students who want to help their community and are also looking to pursue a career in law. So over the past few weeks, students from across New South Wales were invited to submit questions to ask you. Using these submissions, we'll have a series of quick speed dating questions. If there are any questions of interest to you, we can discuss that in extra detail. Peter, can you start us off?
Yep, so we'll start off with democracy in North Korea. Democracy across the globe has faced countless threats in the past few decades, and evidently in the past couple of days. On the 21st of March 2013, the United Nations Human Rights Council, during its 22nd session, established the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. The commission, of which you were the chair, was mandated to investigate the systematic, widespread, and grave violations of human rights. The daily lives of North Korean citizens are hard to understand for the rest of the world, given the lack of information and reporting. Mr. Kirby, what most surprised or shocked you about the lives of ordinary North Koreans?
First of all, that we were not permitted in. The United Nations urged North Korea to allow its Commission of Inquiry to enter, but they did not. North Korea preserves the anonymity of its very great wrongs against its own citizens by not allowing independent investigation and people to go in there for the United Nations. But ultimately, that was not a big problem for us because there were 30,000 escapees from North Korea who had fled through China into South Korea, where they have a right to citizenship. And so we went to South Korea, we went to Japan, we had public hearings in London, in Washington, DC, and elsewhere, and we called for submissions. What most shocked us were the terrible crimes against humanity. I, as a person who'd been an Australian judge for 34 years, had to sit in an inquiry listening to stories of the great wrongs done to people in North Korea, put into detention camps, put with their families into detention camps if they were thought to be enemies of the regime. Many of them were not properly fed. Some of them died in the camps. Their bodies were tossed out from the huts in which they were kept. And in the mornings, a wheelbarrow would go by and their body was put into it and they were burned. It was as if I was back in 1945, 46, 47 as a judge inquiring into the terrible wrongs of the Nazis after the Second World War. Suddenly, I found myself, who had spent 34 years listening to wrongs in Australia, listening to the most awful, shocking wrongs to the people of North Korea. We reported on this. Our report went to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly. It went to the Security Council of the United Nations, and it remains before the organs of the United Nations to follow up and to get justice for the people of North Korea.
we read a little bit of your the Commission of Inquiry, a short extract of it, and it's truly, honestly, quite crazy about everything that has happened. And so I do have a question from a student regarding democracy to you. The student asks, how do you see the face of democracy changing in the next decade?
Well, I think the changes are probably going to come about by reason of technology. Technology has such a big impact on the world, and to some extent, the technology is beneficial in that it can bring information, even to North Korea, which is cut off from the internet. Nobody except close allies of the regime have access to the internet and to the global media that we take for granted in Australia. But people are getting mobile phones. They are finding spaces in North Korea where they can get access to the international community. Young people in North Korea are like young people everywhere. Their minds are full of questions, and they don't necessarily accept the propaganda of their leaders, and they're questioning, and that's a good thing. But one of the problems of new media is that it can scrutinize our preferences, scrutinize our interests, scrutinize the social media that we use, and scrutinize the products that we purchase. And a question is then presented, as by the Cambridge Analytics case, as to whether it will be possible in the future for people to have an independent mind to exercise in their democratic choices, or whether they will be so manipulated by the information that bombards them that they will simply respond to the information that they're given. And this is something that really goes back to the election of John Kennedy as the President of the United States back in 1960, and the way in which, by targeting messages and specific messages, he was able to win the election. As it turned out, he was a pretty good president. But if it can be done by a good president, it can be done by someone not so good. Mr. Trump also used manipulative messages that were very specifically targeted on particular groups, and that can diminish the independent judgment of the citizens of the country. So we've got to watch that, and we've got to watch it in Australia and watch it throughout the world.
Going back to October 2014, when you were at the United Nations headquarters in New York, urging the Democratic Republic Peoples of Korea to release the UN Commission of Inquiry in North Korea and to invite members to Pyongyang to explain it and answer questions. What was it like sitting in the UN headquarters?
Well, it's a great place, a huge building at the bottom of 42nd Street in New York. And I was actually there when an Australian, Professor James Crawford, was being advanced and supported by the Commonwealth of Australia to become elected as a judge of the International Court of Justice. And he would be going down one escalator and I was going up another in my duties on North Korea. He'd worked with me in the Australian Law Reform Commission and was a brilliant man and a top advocate and a great professor at Cambridge University. Sadly, he was elected to the World Court, the International Court of Justice, but earlier this year, unfortunately, he died when in office as a young man. And the moral of that story is that you have a very short span of years in this world, and it's the duty of all of us to do our best to make the most of the gifts of nature, of our intelligence and of our moral sense. And he did that through the World Court. I did it through my inquiry on North Korea and earlier work in Cambodia and other countries. But all of us, in whatever way, little or big, in the United Nations headquarters or in the field for the United Nations, we ought to be trying our best to build a world on the principles of the United Nations. And those principles were peace and security, universal human rights, justice and equality. And these are the principles that have guided my life ever since I was a boy at Fort Street High School from 1951 to 55.
That's truly inspiring. About your experience in the UN headquarters, we have a burning question from a student. They asked, "We've heard about your showdown with Kim Song, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, deputy head of mission. Can you tell us more about that showdown?"
Well, he was the ambassador for the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. And I came in to take my seat in the big committee room of the United Nations General Assembly, and I saw he was sitting in his place. It has DPRK on the banner, and so I thought, will I go up and say hello to him, because he had refused to allow us to come in, but. And then I thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't, but I got up because I was taught at school and by my parents to be well-mannered. So I got up and went over and reached out my hand to shake his hand. He took my hand and shook it, but soon we were in disagreement in the Human Rights Council about the report. He attacked the report, and I defended the report, and I said, well, if you don't like what we've said, let me come in and we will have a look at North Korea, and if you show that we have made a mistake, we will admit it. But they didn't let us come in because they're afraid of the independent world seeing what happens in North Korea.
We congratulate you and your team for shedding light into the abuses occurring in the DPRK for the world to observe. Since then, some good things have occurred. A human rights field office has been established in Seoul, and food production has improved in the north, but negative developments counterbalance the good. Kim Jong-un has redoubled his efforts to develop a viable nuclear weapons capability and missiles capable of delivering militarized nuclear weapons to Japan and South Korea, and then even further afield as far west as the west coast of the United States.
We'll now move on to LGBTQ plus related questions. In 1996, you were appointed as a justice in the High Court of Australia. You were the first openly gay justice in the court's history. The struggle for LGBTQI plus rights has been a fierce one, but we've seen massive progress made in the last century. We went from a time when homosexuality was explicitly illegal in the early 1900s to same-sex marriage being legalized across the nation in 2017. So the first question is, did being gay and growing up in such a hostile environment have an impact on your approach to the legal system and the world at large?
Being gay was not a good message when I was at school. I think what you were expected to be was thoroughly ashamed of yourself. And there were other features of our society at that time which were cruel and unfair. Even in Australia, we didn't really respect the Indigenous people, the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. We didn't really respect the equality of women. We didn't really respect people of colour and different racial backgrounds. We had the White Australia policy, and LGBT people were locked up and criminalised. So that wasn't a good environment in which to grow up. And to be truthful, when I was at school, I very carefully hid my sexuality, and that was what everybody did, what you were expected to do. Straight people knew there were gay people, and the deal was that if you pretended you were straight, then you'd be left alone. And that is what I did for many years. Subsequently, I met my partner, Johan. He came from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands didn't have criminal laws against gays. And he didn't really want to be pretending that he was not gay. And ultimately, he said to me, we should stand up and we should be truthful. We should do this for the young people of Australia today and for people outside Australia. And I said, oh, don't you think we should leave this until after I've ended being a judge? And he said, no, we've got to do it. People from the Netherlands are not quite the same as us. They're very in your face. And that's one of the wonderful things about Australia, having people from different cultural backgrounds. We can get good messages and some bad messages, but we can get mostly good messages about the great variety of our blue planet. And so we stood up, and we continue to stand up for the rights of LGBTIQ people in Australia and throughout the world. It is something you don't choose and you cannot change, and you should not be made to feel ashamed of it. And I hope that the contributions of Jan and me and of other people who struggle for equality for gay people are appreciated in our school system and will be carried forth into the future, because we've got to do what we can, not only in Australia, but in many countries overseas. Just imagine what it is like to be a gay person in Afghanistan at this moment. It is something that really fills me with great concern and deep anxiety and great stress to think of the horrors that will await people unless they pretend that they are straight. And that is what will be forced on people. And we have to do what we can for people who are Aboriginal, for people of races different from our own, and for women, and for LGBTIQ.
Mr. Kirby, I guess you already answered this in your previous reply, but was it hard to come out as gay?
Yes, it was. It was difficult because at the time I was younger, it was criminal. It wasn't criminal to be gay, but it was criminal to do anything about it. And that's why people were really forced to pretend. Well, there are still some people, and I regret to say some churches, that require that you just don't talk about it, that you don't admit to it, that they don't react with loving care and compassion and support, even for students at some schools, which is a shocking thing. And for staff in some schools in Australia. I'm talking about Australia. I'm not talking about Afghanistan now. And therefore, this is unfinished business. But we've made a lot of progress, and we've got to go on making progress, and not just on LGBT things. What you've got to learn, if you are the subject of discrimination, you've got to learn that other people are suffering discrimination, and you've got to stand up for all of them and against discrimination of any kind. And we in Australia, because we have so many different races and cultures here, we have a good opportunity to be a leader in the world, as a leader for non-discrimination and for loving one another. And that is what all the great religions of the world teach us.
Having a multicultural country, it really opens your eyes to so many different things. Your judicial career has been one of great success, honour and value to the community. You were admitted to the New South Wales Bar in 1967, chairman of the Australian Law Reform Commission from 1975 to 84. You were the Deputy President of the Australian Conciliation and Arbitration Commission from 1975 to 1983. You were the Judge of the Federal Court of Australia in 1983 to 84. You're also the President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal from 1984 to 96, President of the Solomon Islands Court of Appeal.
Oh, no more, Audrey.
But it truly highlights how you've done so much work for the community through all of these incredible roles you've had. I think it really is worth to mention all of these titles that you've held.
Well, my job as a judge was extremely interesting, and my school had a long tradition of judges and numbers on the High Court of Australia and other courts. It was a tradition of the school, and we were encouraged in debating and in play day and to express ourselves. And I think that's something very good in public education, to encourage people of every background and without necessary parental wealth or a parental example or opportunities to make our own way and to secure positions of excellence. But it's hard work. I mean, I'm still working very hard, and that is a choice you make in life. And I believe that it was a choice in my case that I have never regretted. I'm grateful for the opportunities that I was presented by my parents and their loving care and upbringing of me, and by my schools and my wonderful teachers. Let us all give a call out for our teachers and what we owe to our teachers. Next to our parents, it's generally our teachers that we owe most to our intellectual and moral development.
My teachers have truly been amazing. So if my teachers are listening, please, this message goes out to you. I do have a question about your career. So what has been the most memorable moment of your career?
Well, there are so many, and they're still going on. It wasn't all plain sailing. In the time on the High Court of Australia, a difference arose between me and my colleagues. I took the view that international law, which is such a big development, which I'd seen in the field in my work in Cambodia and in North Korea, or for North Korea, it showed me how international law was playing an increasing part. And my efforts to secure recognition of the role of international law in our own Australian legal system were not always successful. So I'm not mentioning one of my triumphs. I'm mentioning one of the areas where I didn't succeed. But one of the great strengths of the Australian legal system is that the judges are not corrupted, and they have to give reasons, and they have to sit in public, and they have to be scrutinised both by the legal profession and by the general community. And that means that even though you may lose in the short run in your propositions of law, such as the use of international law in migration cases, for example, the role of the independent judiciary plays a very important function in Australia in holding the balance and in upholding the rule of law, which is protective of all of us, great or small, powerful or powerless, rich or poor. We are all under the law, and that is one of the great principles of Australia. It isn't so in many countries, and it is so in this country, and I hope it will always be so.
Mr. Kirby, what has influenced your decision to enter the field of law after graduating Fort Street High School?
I was not quite so good at mathematics, though in the end it clicked. I had a wonderful teacher, Jim Coronius, at Fort Street High School, and at the very end it clicked just in time for my leaving certificate. I didn't come dux of Fort Street, I was second in the school. But thanks to wonderful teachers, it clicked, and I think you really got to persevere with the areas where you're not so strong. But I was very strong in debating. I had the gift of the gab. I was very strong in play acting. I was not quite so good in sport. But because I had the gift of the gab and I was in debating and so on, it was pretty inevitable that I would go into law. I didn't like the idea of cutting up frogs, and I didn't like the idea of doing some of the horrible things that medical students did. So law it was for me, and I've never regretted that choice because law is essentially about power and the control of power by rules. And that is the challenge of law. And every day in the law as a judge, it was like having a very interesting novel with very interesting and unbelievable stories of people's lives that you had to unravel and had to try to solve the problems that had come up and were presented to you in court. A very interesting life, a very interesting job, but very hard work. It's not for those who want an easy life. Law is a life of discipline, hard work, concentration, and at least 6 days a week working on your cases.
About what you said about the debating thing, I do debating at Fort Street as well. And a lot of, because we have debating coaches here to help us with our skills and everything. A lot of them are law students. In fact, the majority of them are law students.
Oh, that's great. And one thing I learned, everyone who starts out in debating is nervous. I was very nervous. I was trembling like a leaf at the beginning when I was doing debating at school. I don't know, you probably don't do this, Audrey, because you're probably as hard as nails, but I was trembling. But subsequently, it becomes easier when you know that you are not going to muck it up completely. You get more confidence in yourself and you can do the job of debating and persuasion much more successfully.
What were the best and worst parts about being a Justice of the High Court of Australia?
The best parts were I had a wonderful office, my chambers in Canberra. All the judges have different wood in their offices. I had lovely yellow birch from Tasmania. It was a beautiful environment in which to work, and the facilities are grand. The library is wonderful. My two staff members, I always chose one young man and one young woman to work with me for a year, and I had wonderful secretary and excellent barristers appearing before us. So they were the good things. Also, my partner came down. Johan would come down every week that we were sitting in Canberra, and it was an agreeable thing. And on the balcony that I had, the birds of Canberra would come, and the big balloons would float by. So it had great natural beauties and wonderful facilities. What was the worst thing? Well, there was the relentless work, the continuous series of problems. You don't get easy problems in the High Court of Australia. The problem wouldn't be there if it was easy. But the jurisdiction of the court comes by special leave mostly of the justices, and therefore only the hardest problems arose. And the fact that there were differences between the judges, especially about the role of international law, that wasn't an easy thing. But we got over that and got on with our work, and the work kept you busy, and it was a great privilege to serve on the highest court in our country.
You've obviously seen lots of law cases. We're just wondering, what was your favorite law case and why?
Well, again, every case, some judges go to sleep in court. I had a judge in the Court of Appeal when I was the president, and he would fall asleep after lunch. And I had to push him and poke him and drop books and try to wake him up. My problem was exactly the opposite. I hyperventilated on the court and kept awake all the time because of the interest and importance of the issues with which we were dealing. One of the cases that came very soon after my appointment related to the Mabo case. I didn't actually sit on the Mabo case, which was decided in 1992. That was the case that decided, against 150 years of previous law, that Australian law did recognise the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to their land in Australia. But a question came up in a case soon after I came to the court as to whether that principle applied to the great pastoral leases throughout Australia. And 3 judges came in saying it did, and 3 judges came in saying it didn't, and I had the casting vote. And that showed me the power of the judges of the High Court. And I said that it did apply, that the principle of land rights did apply in the great pastoral leases, which, by the way, were bigger than some countries of Europe, the pastoral leases in Australia. So that was an important case that came up in my first months on the High Court of Australia. And it was an important case, not only for the Aboriginal litigants in the case, the Wick people in Queensland, but it was important for the legal system of our country.
Whilst we're on the topic of landmark things, so the recent Black Lives Matter protests that have obviously gripped the world after the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in the United States spurred intense discussion around our current approach to criminal justice. So we've even seen activists call for actions such as defunding the police or rethinking our punitive approach to incarceration. So the question is, what law reform do you think we need to make to address these inequalities in the legal system? And how can we restore confidence in the law amongst those unhappy with how they've been treated by it?
I don't think there's a loss of confidence in the general community in the law, but we do, as you say, have to ensure that we have and deserve confidence of the minorities who are sometimes on the receiving end of the law. And that is especially true of our Indigenous people, the First Nations people of Australia. The numbers of Indigenous prisoners in Australia is one of the highest, if not the actual highest, of any cultural group in the world that are imprisoned. It's even higher than the imprisonment rates in China and in the United States, which are big imprisoning countries. What we have to do is to follow up the report of the Law Reform Commission, which I originally chaired, which is still going strong, to remove these sources of increased imprisonment of the Indigenous people. We have to perhaps increase the age at which Aboriginal people and all people in Australia are liable to be dealt with in criminal courts, increasing that from the year 12 years to 14 years or even 16 years has been suggested, and that is under consideration by the Attorneys General. They're taking, as usual, a very long time about making a decision. But what we have to do as a nation is to reduce the number of people who are Indigenous who end up in our custodial institutions, because there is a revolving door. And once you get into that revolving door, you tend to stay in it for a long time. And that isn't good at any time, but it's especially not good in times of COVID-19. So there are many things that the Law Reform Commission has suggested, and we as a nation owe it to our First Nations people to ensure that we address the problem that leads to excessive numbers of our Indigenous people in our prisons, because that is a national shame to Australia.
Indigenous people are disproportionately affected. We've got, I think, around 3% of our population is comprised of First Nations people, but 28% of those in prison are First Nations people. And so I think that's a really, really big problem. And what you've mentioned really highlights the changes that are necessary.
We've known the size of the problem for decades. But what we've got to do is move on the solutions to the problem. And part of the solution is to make some problems of Indigenous people non-criminal, so that it's dealt with in a different way. When I was young, as a young gay boy and man, I was subject to the criminal law. And I think that was solved by removing that criminal element from the treatment and attitude towards LGBT. We haven't completely dealt with the prejudice and the shame that some people inflict upon gay people, but the same solution may be necessary, removing some things from the criminal realm and dealing with them in different ways in society.
What do you think young people should be doing to foster a more equal and just future?
Well, the first thing is to become involved. I've always thought, if I look at my life, how did you get into these positions? Well, it all started by getting involved at my high school, at Fort Street, in student activities. I was a joiner. You've got to be a joiner. You've got to join clubs and societies. You've got to relate to your fellow students and your fellow human beings. You've got to be interested in them and in their world and in their problems. When I left and went to university, I joined the Council for Civil Liberties, and I joined other organizations that worked for disadvantaged people pro bono, doing it for nothing, alongside the work that was paying my salary. I was doing work for nothing. You've got to be willing to do things for others without immediate pay rewards. And I think that's the solution. You've got to be interested in your fellow human beings and in our world. We can now look from the moon at our world and see what a beautiful thing planet Earth is. This wonderful body in space, this blue planet. And yet at the moment when we're thinking of Afghanistan and of other areas of the world and the terrible violence and cruelty that people inflict upon each other, we realize that this blue planet can do with a lot of improvement. And it falls to the younger generation. It falls especially to younger Australians with their many blessings to be without prejudice, not to hate other people because they're a little bit different, not to disparage and diminish and discriminate against people because they are a bit different. When I was at Fort Street in 1951, there were only about 10 Asian Australian students at the school. Now, when I go back to the school, it's about 50% and more who are Asian Australians. And it's a wonderful thing for me to go back to my old school and see this change that has happened. It's a great strength of public education that it's there for all people, of all races, of all cultures, of different gender and of different sexuality. And that's what we've got to build in our nation and in our world. Nation of multiculturalism and a world of peace, justice, universal human rights, and the rule of law. And that's what we should all be dedicating our lives to do.
I know many of our viewers are young, aspiring leaders who are actively trying to involve themselves in work that makes our world a better place. And I was wondering if you had any particular advice for them, any wise words that you would like to share.
Well, I'm often asked that question because many young people are very idealistic, and it's natural. If you're not idealistic when you're young, then often you won't be idealistic later on. So it's natural that they should want to serve the world and maybe serve the United Nations or serve Australia in helping people in other lands, as we often do. I think the answer to it is to try to get involved at home in the activities of civil society, to join civil society, to be a joiner, and then to take part in international activities and try to get involved in those activities in ways that will advance the world. It's also important to realize that in the terms of the law, for example, some people think it's very important to be big of heart. But if you're going to be helpful in the law, you've also got to be big of mind. It's got to be heart and mind in synchronicity with each other. And nothing is a bigger nuisance than having somebody who's got all heart but hasn't learned the skills of the profession of law. or hasn't learned skills of their profession in order to make them available to the wider world. So the lesson of it all is you've got to concentrate on your studies. You've got to concentrate on doing the very best you can. Not everybody can come first, and not everybody can become a Justice of the High Court of Australia or Prime Minister of Australia. But we can all play our part and make our country and the world a better place. And that should be the aim of everybody in all their different ways, with all their different talents, including in the arts, in music, in poetry, in drama, and all the other things that enliven the spirit. We've got to make our world a better place. This beautiful blue planet, sailing there through the infinity of the universe. There's space for all of us, and we have to love one another and uphold the human rights of everybody, no exceptions.
Those are truly beautiful and inspiring words. Every time you say beautiful blue planet, it really makes me appreciate it, because often we're so easy to overlook the little things around us. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Kirby.
Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you.
And thank you, Peter, too.
We certainly know that students participating in this event will take something away from your admirable career that is still going on to this day. All the best for the future. And to the audience, thank you for participating in the Fort Street Future Leaders Week. We hope you and your families also stay safe and well during this difficult time ahead of all of us. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Audrey. Bye-bye.